Hi everyone, welcome. We're out here in my garden, and here in front of us we've got my outdoor worm bin. And today is August 8th, and technically it was last year on August 9th when I started this bin, but since it was a leap year this year, it's actually going to take 266 days to get to August 9th, tomorrow, which would be the calendar birthday of this bin. But today's 365 days, and in most cases that counts as a year. So today, on this 1-year anniversary of this outdoor worm bin being launched, and this worm bin did survive being outside all winter with the exception of just a couple days when it was placed inside to make sure it didn't freeze on some very, very cold days. But after a year, I've decided that it's time to harvest the castings and to pull out the worms. And the main motivation for that is that I've got somebody who's very interested in adopting some of my worms, and it did seem like the population in this bin would be satisfactory in quantity for what they need. So I'm going to get to work on extracting the worms, harvesting the castings, and to that end I've got a number of things laid out here on the table. And rather than performing this activity in a single tub, it seemed like it might make good sense to do it in 2 tubs, because there is always a little bit of a delay when you're picking through the material. Once you've scrubbed off some of the material and sifted it, you do need to give a little bit of time for the pile that you just removed some castings from to allow the worms that might be right at the surface to dive down once again, so that you've got the chance to skim off more material. So it seemed like if I put a pile of stuff into each bin, I could alternate between bin and bin and hopefully save myself that waiting time that usually goes between screenings, and try to get the job done a little bit more quickly. So I've got about, I don't know, maybe 3 hours between now and the meeting time of the person that's coming to get these worms to take them off my hands. So I got to get to work. So let's get started. And you know, since I'm a little bit pressed for time today, I don't really intend to get into as much detail and talking about everything and showing everything. So I'm just going to get into little highlights as we go and put together a short little video about it, but I'm not going to go crazy making this into a major production. So here and there we'll pop in to see how things are progressing. But I got to get this done, so I got to limit my time fiddling with the camera today. One of the notable things in this container that we've been tracking the progress of is the cork, and here it is. So that I'm going to hang on to and set it aside. Another thing that I'm doing as I pick out all this stuff from the bag that everything is in is that I am just manually pulling out these larger bits so that they don't get in the way of the separation and screening process, because this material definitely has a lot more large chunk material in it than most bins that are in the process of being screened. And I guess this would be the other large object that we've been tracking in this bin, which is a pumpkin stem, which is definitely breaking down quickly. But between this and the cork, these were the 2 more notable items that we've been checking out here and there. So we've cleared out the majority of what was in this container, but not all of it. So once I've collected some stuff that didn't go through the screen, I'll just plop it all in here to give these little guys some cover. So now the key objective here is to give this material that's out here on the surface a little bit of time, so that any worms that are on the top start to sense the bright daylight overhead and dive down into the material. And then theoretically there's a thin layer of material on the top that should be worm free for the most part, and that's the stuff that we're going to gradually start skimming off the top and collecting and putting off to the side, driving the worm population in the pile down, down, down until you're really left with nothing more than just a pile of worms at the bottom. And like I said earlier, that is my objective here, is to not so much harvest castings but to collect worms. So I'm going to be doing my best to get to the finish line on this as quickly as possible. And since it does take time for the worms at the very surface here to sense the light, you got to give them a few minutes to dive down. So after you've done a skim and you start sensing worms and seeing them there on the top, that's when you stop skimming material, and then you proceed to sifting. So as I sift the material, some of the stuff will pass through, and that'll be the nice finished castings, but anything that doesn't will be mainly bedding and food items that have not yet broken down, which will all be collected and placed right back into the container so that this can continue to be a nice new fresh outdoor worm bin. But since it does take time for the worms to dive down, my thought was to alternate. So now I'll just go from doing this bin to doing that bin, back and forth, and then that delay of waiting for these little guys at the surface to dive down doesn't end up just biting into my time. I can actually keep on skimming and sifting non-stop, going from bin to bin. And boy, is this material nice. The last time I followed this process, I used a paintbrush rather than my hand to do the skimming. I just figured if I don't use the paintbrush, that's just one less thing for me to clean at the end. So today I'm going to just do it with my hand, and that works pretty good too. Should be just fine. So as time goes on, the amount of castings in this red bucket do begin to accumulate, which is pretty cool. But it does become a bit heavy, so I will need to offload it, but let's see how we're doing so far. It's pretty nice material, nice and deep and dark and rich in color. Certain things are going to slip through the screen, so I'll pick them out by hand. But even though it doesn't seem like much, castings, even a small amount, have a tremendous amount of weight. So I'm going to need an offload bucket to put all this into so I can keep having a nice light sifter to work with so I don't weigh myself down unnecessarily. But we'll do that in a few minutes. I think I'm still able to handle it. It's not that heavy yet. But we're making pretty good progress. So you can see that this is really progressing quite nicely at this point. The piles are getting really low, and I'm almost wondering if I should combine what's left in each of these bins into a single pile at this point. And I did poke around into this one earlier just to go below the surface about an inch or so, and it is pretty much mobbed with worms, which is what we're after here. I'm just hoping that the number of worms that I end up with here is the amount that I sort of semi-promised the recipient of these worms. But I'm glad to say that this process of shifting from one container to the other and giving the other container that you just did time for the worms to dive down while you're working the other one does seem to be a good, efficient way to manage it. So otherwise you skim off, you sift it out, but then you're waiting for the worms to dive down so you can get back to skimming more material off the top. But this way you simply leave this bin, you go work on the next one, and then you come back in a couple minutes, and by then the worms would have already driven themselves down into the material, so you don't really lose much time, no waiting. And I even thought about maybe bringing out a third bin to do this 3 separate containers, but luckily the material fit pretty neatly into these 2 bins, so I'm glad that it worked out this way. pretty efficient setup, if I do say so myself. So I was growing curious to see how many worms are remaining in this pile here. And I was also sensing that there was still a large number of big chunks of stuff in here too. So I figured I'd kill two birds with one stone and try to pick out all these larger chunks really quick, so that the material that they're inhabiting is mainly loose, small size castings material, free of all these large chunks that they could hide in and hide around. At the same time, we could see how many worms are actually in this. And you can see there's quite a number of worms in here. So I am starting to think that now that it's all been sort of stirred together, I could probably do the same to the other pile as well. Pick out all the large chunks and then combine the two. Combine them both into just one large pile and start driving them all down into one single location at this point. Because both piles are starting to get nice and small. I'm wondering how many we're going to end up with here. There's quite a few. So now I'm going to go ahead and I think once I skim this last little portion off the top of this pile, I'm going to go ahead and combine both piles into a single tub. Maybe I'll also go through this one and make sure I picked out all these larger chunks of stuff before I do that. Then we'll have just a pile of fairly fine castings with a whole bunch of worms in it, and then we'll start driving towards the finish line, which is hopefully going to result in a nice big worm ball at the end, a nice big pile of worms. And the castings that are piling up are pretty nice too. I've already emptied my red bucket, and it filled up one of my pink planters. Pink planters are a pretty good size planter. And then I'm probably going to end up with just as many, if not more, additional worm castings once we finish sifting the remaining material over here. So yeah, I think it's about time to just combine all these into a single pile and continue just working one pile down. I guess as I see large chunks passing by, I'll try to intercept them and grab them. And as we work our way down to the bottom, here too, large amounts of worms. Yeah, large amounts of worms. Very cool. Very cool. And the castings are just so fine, so flaky, not sticky or damp or anything. They just flake apart perfectly. And they're not dry, not by any means. They've got like the perfect moisture to them. Very cool. So I'm just going to organize this into a nice, neat pile. Give these worms a little chance to start diving down again before I start sifting the top of the pile again. I'm wondering how many worms I've ended up with here. It seems like many pounds of worms. But we won't know till we get to the finish. I can't wait to see. We'll give this a little time now for these little worms to start making their way back down to the bottom again. We can continue. So I'm definitely making my way down here. The pile's becoming pretty low anymore. And it seems like if I do sort of skim into it a little deeper, I do see a huge number of worms right below the surface. So I'm starting to feel like I'm kind of approaching the worm ball at this point. So I think at this point, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually try to reduce this pile down to almost just a worm ball, trying to skim as much castings as I can off of the top of it. And that'll start giving us a sense of how many worms we've actually managed to round up here. So let me just skim this stuff off and dump it. And we can get in a little bit closer to see what's happening here. So when I did this last time, I would just go ahead and I'd pull maybe an inch off the top, and that would end up leaving almost all worms. And then they really start getting active, because now you've got almost all of them exposed to the daylight, all trying to drive themselves down, pushing the compost to the surface much more quickly. So I'm starting to think that that's the best way to proceed. So I'm going to see if I can try to do a skim off the top to see if I can get to the worm ball rapidly. Oops. Obviously, the stuff that I'm tossing off to the side is also very rich in worms too. So maybe this is the right time to sort of get into two-pile mode again. Let them start diving down into individual little piles. But I think the main pile is the easiest to try to skim the material off of as they all try to retreat away from the bright sunlight. And I'll just take whatever I skim off and place that into the other pile on the side. And then at some point, I'll just start leaving it again until I don't see any worms anymore, and then I can start skimming more and more castings off the top. And that'll start revealing how many worms we really ended up with here. And it does seem like we've got quite a few. So we're getting there. Sorry, I just noticed the camera was not oriented properly. Alright, let's give that a few minutes to settle, if that's the right word for it. Maybe pull these guys out too and let them be in a pile of their own as well. Okay. So as they work their way down, and you keep skimming off more and more of the material, they have less and less stuff to hide in. So every now and then you pull back some of the castings and all you see is worms. That's really what we're after here. So many. Pretty awesome. Give them a little more time to retreat again. So as you can see, our worm pile is starting to develop pretty nicely, and even these other little secondary piles that I had set up are also resulting in the worms that are in them diving down. And then I just keep skimming the material off, placing it into yet this other pile over here. Now we can really start to see how many worms were in this tub. Keeping in mind that we probably did send a lot of them over either into the finished compost collection or into that collection of material that didn't make it through the screen. But it's all good, because the material that didn't make it through the screen is just going to stay in the bag, and it's going to become the basis of my bag going forward. So they'll kind of like be the initial population. And then whatever worms ended up in the finished compost, they're just going to end up in my garden, and that's just as good. That's just as good as well. So it's a win-win-win in all directions. And I just found out that I've got about 35 minutes before I've got to meet up with the person that's going to be adopting these worms from me. So I'm rapidly running out of time. And it's still about a 5 or 10 minute drive over to the meeting location too. So I've only got so much time left to finish this little project up here, and then I gotta skedaddle. So now my two secondary piles that I had over here have gradually transformed into this one pile here, and everything that I've been pulling off those three has started becoming this new final pile, if you will. And it's making me wonder how many worms I've managed to compile into this pile over here. Okay, well, with this pile, it does seem like we've actually managed to come up with almost like a little bit of a worm ball that we can maybe let them retreat into themselves or into their own little pile of worms, leaving the castings behind on the surface. So that might be another little small amount that we can add to the final collection of worms that we've rounded up. And I've been skimming this pile over here down too, gradually, trying to see what I can end up with. I have a feeling that these two piles have probably just as many worms in them as that pile right there, which is almost castings free at this point. So I'm not even going to put these on the scale. I really don't have the time. I've got about 10 or 11 minutes to make it over to the meeting point. So I've got to just put these babies in a box and head out so I can deliver these guys to their new owner. Before I go, I just wanted to conclude on the video here by saying thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and found it interesting. I hope that you did, and if you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated, and also consider subscribing to the channel as well. Alright, I gotta fly. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.